Thank you so much for having me here, Patrick. And I know everybody loves to listen to a lawyer, especially late in the afternoon. So I will do my best to make it. Well, great. The presentation is called Wagging the Dog. And what I'd like to do today is touch upon where the current law and regulations are, what's on the near-term horizon, and also leave you with some practical tips of how you can look at things and take steps to identify, mitigate, and hopefully compartmentalize some of the risk that's inherent in such an uncertain legal and regulatory environment right now. A little bit about me. I am based in Las Vegas, but I'm rarely there. I'm typically traveling for work about 3 weeks out of every month. And aviation is not only my business as an aviation attorney, but it's also a passion of mine. So I fly everything from a Lear 75 down to an experimental open cockpit plane that I helped build a couple of years ago. So let's start out with laws, lawsuits, and unsettled areas. And I'm actually not a litigator. I view it, if I do my job right, I have minimized the risk of litigation for my clients. So there are a variety of areas right now where there's some new law. Of course, we've talked about Part 107 a bit today. What's interesting on the aviation law side is that one of the most unclear areas when it comes to aviation law is how some of the older laws will be applied to UAS. So a good example of that would be we've seen aircraft been shot out of the air. Now, destruction of an aircraft is a federal crime. So far, those cases have not been prosecuted federally. So again, we have some laws on the books that have been around for quite a long time. The FAA has tried to apply some of them to the unmanned side that they've used in the manned world for many years, but surprisingly on others, they've been radio silent. When it comes to the state laws and local ordinances, it is a real patchwork quilt. And I think it was you who brought up the question about, hey, if you stand on this side of the fence and you're not doing a takeoff and landing from an area, can you fly over an area? I know a lot of aviation attorneys who would be happy to take that case if somebody was trying to prosecute it. And that's part of the problem right now. The FAA has not been really zealous with going out to states and local municipalities that have been passing a variety of local laws and regulations. So just because there's a law or regulation doesn't mean it's enforceable. So there are a variety of things on the books. It makes for a really difficult operating environment. I think a lot of the state laws and local ordinances that have been passed may not withstand the scrutiny of a judicial challenge. But until there are those test cases out there, they're on the books, and people are going to try to enforce them. So the areas where we see a lot of activity on the state law and local ordinance side are trespass, for instance, and invasion of privacy. Now, in the limited guidance that the FAA has given to states and local municipalities, they've said, listen, you can't regulate routes of flight, those sorts of things, but you can regulate what is done with the aircraft. So an example would be the trespass or invasion of privacy. So it's taking laws that have been on the books for a long time and then creating new applications of those. An example on the trespass side is there is now a civil trespass cause of action in the state of Nevada if you fly an unmanned aircraft over certain facilities that are deemed critical infrastructure. So chemical pipelines, the electricity lines that are going along the Colorado River project and Hoover Dam, mining, etc. So what you'll see is various states and some local municipalities have passed these laws and regulations on uses, and you need to know what applies in the environment in which you're operating. Another area is invasion of privacy. And actually here in California, they took a law that was originally meant for use with paparazzi and long-range lenses on cameras, and they now include use of UAS for invasion of privacy as a cause of action. The area where I'm starting to see more movement is actually involving taxes. When you have manned aircraft, it's very typical in many states that you have personal property taxes on the aircraft where they're based. And you also have state sales and use taxes. Now, right now, if you're buying a drone off the shelf, you're probably paying sales tax on that when that occurs. But sometimes, especially with things that are shipped interstate, the seller may not be charging that tax. Technically, in most states, they'll say, if you didn't pay sales tax on it and it was shipped into our state, then you owe the equivalent, which would be use tax. This is what states do all of the time with manned aircraft. And as we see higher and higher value unmanned aircraft, I would expect stepped up enforcement on this side. What I have seen is not so much new laws, because state laws typically address aircraft and taxes, but what I have seen is internal guidance at state departments of taxation saying, just to clarify, unmanned aircraft are also deemed aircraft for taxation purposes. And of course, the state will want its funds and its pound of flesh. On the lawsuit side, I've got to side with Patrick here and say I'm not sure we need a lot of new laws out there. You know, we have a lot of current law on the books and case law that is on topics of personal injury, property damage, trespass, and invasion of privacy. And although those laws may be tweaked slightly to address causes of action involving UAS, I don't think we need a whole bunch of new rules and laws on the books. There has been very little litigation so far in this area, and it's very state specific. So until there are more test cases, we won't know how things will apply. But a good example would be a personal injury. The Virginia Bull Run crowd. There was a race, and they had a variety of people for a running of the bulls. And ironically enough, nobody was injured by the bulls, but a drone hit two people and injured them, and a lawsuit ensued. So this is, though, pretty typical. If you hit somebody with something else, whether it be a car or a bicycle, you would expect a personal injury lawsuit. So I don't think this is really a novel area. Same with property damage. Whether you mistakenly fly a drone through somebody's window or you hit a baseball erroneously through their window, it's a property damage claim. On trespass, the drone slayer case, which some of you may be familiar with, is an interesting one in that the person whose drone was shot out of the air actually did not file a state law claim for property damage. What they did was they filed a federal lawsuit, and they were trying to get the feds to step up on airspace, trespass issues, etc. The federal judge dismissed the suit and said, hey, this is more of a state matter. And so again, we just have a lack of clarity in this area right now. So what is coming to help fill in some of the patchwork of holes? In the near term, there are actually two bills in our current congressional session that you should be aware of and that you should take a look at. One is Senate Bill 631. That is the Drone Aircraft Privacy and Transparency Act. And it's been sitting in a committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation since last March. But the big picture of this bill is it tries to create a privacy framework for enforcement. And not only privacy principles, but then it would require operators to fill out a data collection statement on how they're going to be using their UAS and what kind of data would be collected. And then information from this statement would be available in a public database on the FAA website that lists the grant of authority for the operation of the UAS, whatever their privacy statement is on that UAS operation, and information about the owner, operator, and the equipment's technical capabilities. So this is incredibly broad. They do talk about the use of data collection for law enforcement purposes, and they do note that there are Fourth Amendment search and seizure issues to be addressed, and so a lot of it is limiting when it can be used for law enforcement purposes and when you need a warrant, etc. Also, on the privacy principles side, there are some exceptions noted for news gathering organizations due to First Amendment principles. Now, if there is a violation under the way this is currently written of the privacy principles, they actually have a couple different remedies here. One would be a civil remedy that can be prosecuted by the state or by an individual as an unfair or deceptive act or practice. And this is a hot topic right now with everything going on with Facebook. Second, they would allow the FAA to revoke authorizations and certificates as enforcement actions. So again, finding out what the privacy principles would be, how those would be defined. I think this is a terrible bill, actually. And I think it has laudable aims, but it creates more problems than it solves. So this is something that I encourage you to get familiar with and speak up with your legislator on this topic. Another one is the Reauthorization Act of 2018. And this touches on so many of the topics that we've discussed today. So what they propose in this bill is funding for the FAA, and this bill touches just about everything in aviation. So when it talks about airman certification, airport funding, whether you can smoke on aircraft, a wide variety of things. But there are two specific sections that focus in on UAS. And so I'm going to hit some of the key points from that, but I encourage you to dive into it and take a look yourself. So it talks about risk-based permitting with a 5-year permit being granted for airworthiness for UAS. And that permit would apply not only to the UAS equipment itself as an airworthiness certificate, but also an authorization for the operation. They also talk about the unmanned traffic management system for 400 feet and below traffic. And they're talking about certification of unmanned navigation facilities as well as traffic systems. There are a whole host of areas where they're asking for studies, research, input to be reported back to Congress. And on the R&D side, it's in a wide variety of areas, including cybersecurity is one of them. And also the role of federal, state, and tribal governments in the oversight and regulation of traffic at 400 feet and below. So that's a very hot topic, it's contentious, and strangely enough, the FAA here is not banging the preemption drum. They're instead saying, well, let's look into this and see how we might work together. So it's an area that's going to be interesting to watch evolve. Another big area that can impact the industry is a study regarding how are they going to finance the services provided to UAS. You know, on the manned aviation side, they typically get it through a couple of ways. One is through aviation fuel taxes, if you're not an airline. But for the airlines, you have a variety of taxes and passenger per head taxes. Those simply can't be adapted to the UAS market. So they're trying to find a way to fund the regulation, oversight, ATC services, and interestingly enough, they mentioned not only VFR, but also instrument flight rules services as well. And so the study is supposed to slice and dice data by types, classes, and categories of activities. And so it looks like they're looking at a variety of fee structures, and we'll see what the funding mechanism would be. Some of the other areas that were touched on in earlier conversations that are hot topics are they've asked for closer DOT and DoD cooperation when it comes to counter-drone measures. So we know that the Department of Defense, of course, has been operating drones for decades and has very robust and very mature technology in comparison to the civilian sector, and they want to see that flow through a little more and a little more quickly. Also, they are talking about spectrum management and looking at that arena, and there are references to private networks. So it will be interesting to see when we come to the traffic management side of things, not only what types of systems and navigation facilities come forward, but also the use of private networks on various spectrums and using competing technologies. What I'm hoping doesn't happen is that they treat it like they have the cellular marketplace with a wide variety of systems that don't necessarily link well together. Because for a national airspace system, that's not going to work smoothly, but we'll see what ideas are proposed. So in this uncertain legal environment that's very immature, there are some things that you can do to help identify and mitigate your legal risk. And when you look at mitigating legal risk, it's all about trying to compartmentalize it or shift it away when you can. So one of the ways you can do this is through a legal structure. We've talked about earlier, I've heard some folks talk about choice of business entities, and depending on the type of operation you have, you may want to segregate high-risk operations in a certain entity, or high-value aircraft, often for fleet management purposes and financing and tax strategy purposes, can be segregated into different entities. So whatever your area of business is, give a serious thought to where you think your biggest risks are, where you think your assets are mainly held, and what the values of those are, and think about whether you can use a legal structure to help protect and preserve that. Also, look at your staffing structures and financing structures. If you are getting ready for a Series C round of financing, then you may not want to go with certain entity structures that might be unattractive to potential investors. Second, on the contracting side, what I often get is people who come in and say, you know, I had this great template that I got from so-and-so who runs a business that's very similar, and it turns out there's a problem, and the contract doesn't seem to really fit what they were trying to use it for. Contracts are very state law specific. So it doesn't hurt to start from a template from somebody else, but make sure you customize it to what you're using it for and your state law that applies. And the key things in contracts are the risk shifting provisions. And those are the most boring provisions to read. But those become the most important provisions when you have problems. So whether it's indemnifications, which essentially is a guarantee, and you want to make sure the folks on the other side are good for it, that they can carry through on that indemnification. Hold harmless, disclaimers, representations, and warranties. These are all tools and mechanisms you should be using to help protect your operations. Also, if you're working directly with consumers, let's say you're doing the filming for skiers going down a ski slope, liability waivers. You know, it's a technique that's been used and a strategy that's been used very successfully in high-risk industries like skydiving for many years. Terry gave a great presentation on insurance. And when you look at your legal structure and your contracting and your operations, figure out where that risk is, and then figure out how much you can insure for. And sometimes that's a business cost decision. But look and know what risk you're taking on and where you're going there. Where somebody else is going to bear that risk for you for a price, or because in the contract you've shifted that risk to them, or whether you're bearing that yourself. But when you accept risk, you need to knowingly accept it and make your decisions based around that. And then on the operational side, earlier, there was a lot of talk about not just being legal, but being proficient. And so this is the area when lawsuits evolve and start coming up on the civil side throughout the variety of states. They're going to be looking at, yes, the personal injury or property damage laws, but then they're going to look at how did you operate? Not only do you have the legal right to operate, but they're going to be looking at negligence standards. So did you have supplemental internal guidance? If so, were you following it? What types of people are you hiring? What types of due diligence are you doing? So it's really important not to forget the business basics and the overlay with the aviation regulations as you move forward with your operations, whether you're a manufacturer, you're just contracting for UAS services, or you are an operator providing services to the industry. So I'm hoping that you won't become the test case that I talk about at my next presentation. And there are a few things you can do here, just a quick checklist. So make sure your business entity is formed in good standing. And every once in a while, particularly if you've been through a big period of growth or change, take a look and reevaluate. Is this the one that you want to stick with? Or should you be looking at converting to a different kind of entity? Look at your contracts, make sure you limit the risk you're assuming and are adequately addressing the aviation regulatory aspects with any type of contract that you have. With the insurance side, make sure that you have the insurance coverage that you're comfortable with, that's affordable for your company, and that you understand what risk you're assuming yourself that's uncovered. And I encourage you to have a robust conversation with your insurance broker on an annual basis, because the products, as Terry talked about, are constantly evolving in the coverages and the coverage requirements based on the claims that are being made. And your operation is probably evolving as well. And then on the operations side, not only making sure that you have the authorizations when needed to do what you're doing, but that you're following the internal written guidance. And another thing to note in the proposed FAA Reauthorization Act is that there are a wide variety of waivers and exemptions contemplated in there, plus a prioritization of projects that if you're deemed to be low risk, and they go through some of the risk factors that they will consider in quantifying what they determine to be the risk of your operation. If you're over rural areas, less congested areas, those types of projects are going to get priority review through the FAA. So understand the current framework. It's changing rapidly. And on the topic of the air carrier certificate, what's currently written in the reauthorization bill is that within 1 year of its passage, that there should be a final rule issued for air carrier certificates for UAS. I think that's pretty optimistic on the timeline. The FAA hasn't been great about meeting the timelines prescribed by Congress, but you can tell that this is a large priority on the horizon. So that's all I've got for now. I'm happy to take questions now or after. Yes, sir.
If you describe Mark Twain's about laws and sausages, 631, how do you think it's going to be modified on the way into the vote, or do you think it's what is the probabilities of it making it there in its current form?
You know, I think it's highly subject to modification. I think it's a deeply flawed bill. I haven't gotten an update on the prospects of it for a vote. I'm wondering actually if our lobbyist has any ideas on Senate Bill 631. Nope. So, but I haven't heard that be hotly debated, and it's just been sitting in committee for over a year. So I don't think its prospects are particularly bright. But, you know, a good example of last night, what happened with ATC privatization is there will be bills that are, or amendments that are proposed, and you think it's dead and you think it's gone away, and then all of a sudden at the last moment it gets pushed into a proposed amendment. So nothing's dead until the session is completely over. So, anything else? All right, thank you.